Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture, I'm going to show you some really cool tools within ArcGIS that allow us to create charts and graphs directly with our spatial data without going to another tool like Excel. We can also do some basic data assessment there because with a graph we can get an aggregate picture of our data set, and we can add things like trend lines in order to really analyze the data visually. So as usual, to start off, what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at census tracts, and census tracts are an analysis unit from the U.S. Census Bureau that they use to aggregate population data that they take at the decennial census, the every 10 years census of people in the United States. And they collect all sorts of information and collect it to these different polygons here so that we can get a sense for what characteristics people in a given area tend to have on average. We're talking everything from income to race and ethnicity to sex to type of job to education to where they go to work. Everything that you can think of demographically, they try to capture this information. So we can see that some of these polygons are really big in the very rural areas, and then they're very dense where we can't actually see the polygons in the more urban areas of California here. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, and Redding. And let's say I have a question here. I'm curious about whether or not density affects total household income, or are they related at all? Are more dense areas more likely to be more wealthy or less wealthy? And I have two conflicting theories. I think that these days, a lot of people with more wealth like to live in central cities. In some places like San Francisco, you have to have more money to live there because they're so expensive to live in. At the same time, lots of times living in rural areas is a choice that wealthy people can make to have more land, to have larger homes and things like that. So I don't really know which one is going to be more likely to occur here. And with the census data and with the charting tools in ArcGIS, I can answer that question, or at least attempt to. So let's take a look at the data we have. If I open the attribute table, I can see that I have already attached the census income data and the census household counts to this data set. So the household income is here. I attached that before, and then the household count is this field here. That's household count estimate, and then household count margin of error here. And what I did to get a sense of density is I calculated the area in square kilometers because the shape area was in a geographic coordinate system that you'll learn about later in this course. And then I calculated households per square kilometer by dividing the household estimate field or the household count estimate field by the area in square kilometers here. So I now have my density measure, which isn't perfect, but households per square kilometer is not a bad measure of density. And then I have the household income here. So let's graph them together first. So up in the attribute table menu, I can go to create graph. And I have a number of different types I can select. So I'm going to choose right now the vertical line graph. And it gives me an option to select which layer or table I want to work with here once I go to the Create Graph wizard. So even though I initiated it from one data table, I can select the option here as well. And then the next option is to select the Y field, or my dependent variable. And in this case, I'm thinking that the income depends upon density. And so I'm going to select my household income as my Y variable here. And we can't really see it here, so let's correct that down at the bottom first before we proceed. So under color, it wants to match it with the layer by default, so that's kind of nice and intuitive. But in this case, let's not change the layer color. Let's just go to custom, and that color is much better. But I could select another color here too. And then let's select an X field here, my independent variable, and we'll make that the households per square kilometer, the density. So we think that income depends on density. And it initially kind of does something crazy here, and it doesn't make any sense. And what I need to do is tell it to sort this ascending. So make sure to connect all of the scatter plot points in ascending order. And already we can see that maybe there's a trend here. I'm not positive. It's a little noisy, but down in this area here where we have very low density, there's a wide range. So low density has very low income all the way up to very high income. Some of the highest income is in lowest density and some of the lowest income is in lowest density. But then we see this kind of drop off of the income as we get to higher density areas. So to me it looks a little, despite the noise here where there's a ton of data representing all values in the really low density areas, as we get to high density it kind of straightens out. And maybe that's just from having fewer data points here. We can see that there just isn't as much change, in part because there are fewer values out in this direction. And I can set some more options here, but let's move along and let's add a trend line. Let's have it kind of give us its assessment of the trend of this graph. And down here at the bottom, I can go to Add New Function. And under function type, I could select trend, but there are also a lot of other things I could do. I could fit a curve, I could do all sorts of stuff. But let's just do a trend line right now. And under the data source for the trend line, I'll select the data series that I just created, which it's calling vertical line. And then let's select a different color for my trend line. We'll make it black so we can see it. So it seems to think that there's a heavily decreasing trend here, or relatively heavily. Not something that I'm willing to just discard offhand as being insignificant, based upon first glance at least. So we could do a whole lot more with this if we want to, and do a lot more assessment. But if I was happy with this and said, yeah, there seems to be a little bit of a trend relating to decreasing household income with increasing density in California, this is an interesting graph worth sharing. I should make this part of my map. So I'm going to go to the next step in the graph wizard now, and I'll call it household income versus density. And then I'll label my axis a little better. So I'll change the y-axis down here to household income. And to set this axis here on the bottom, I'll switch to the bottom tab, and I'll call it household density per square kilometer. And let's also label the units on the y-axis as US dollars. And now I'm going to click Finish. And when I do, it gives me this pop-up that I'm not totally sure what to do with yet. Well, I can do a couple things with it. One, I can leave it open. But two, I can right-click on it and select Add to Layout. And what that'll do is it's going to switch my map to layout view for me, but it adds this graph as an object to my layout view. So all of a sudden in layout view, which we haven't really used since the first course, but is still pretty important in a lot of workflows, I can add custom-made graphs that update with my data in ArcGIS. That's a really handy feature. It's possible, though, that when I get to this point, I'm actually already at the end of my data analysis. I've done some spatial data work and brought together a lot of data, and then the end result is a graph that answers a question. And maybe at that point, I just want to go to Export. And it gives me an export dialog. In true ArcMap form, it's similar to, but it's different from exporting a map document. And I can select to export this graphic as a PDF or as a PNG image or as a JPEG. And I'm going to export it as a JPEG image right now. And I'll select 100% quality at 300 DPI. And we'll leave the default width and height here as well. So I'll click Save. And it asks me where I want to save it to. And I'll save it to my documents for now. And I'll do household income versus density, and it's saved out to the folder. And if I switch to that folder, I can see the image in it, and I can double click on it to view that image somewhere else. And now I could take this image and import it into a Microsoft Word document or some other document my organization was going to publish with the rest of this analysis. I can also put it into illustrations or maps that are combined into a publishable document in some other way as well. Okay, well, that's it for this lecture. In this lecture, I showed you how to create simple graphs with your data in ArcGIS and how to add trend lines and just do a basic analysis of your data directly in ArcGIS by building a graph and assessing your data visually. This is a really cool set of tools, and it's often underutilized in my experience, and so I hope you find it useful. See you next time.